It's been a rather difficult day here at the city. The officer who was shot last night passed away today. And so I'd just like everybody just to take a few moments in reflection and thought and silence, if you will. Officer Libby's picture is there up on the counter. And just take a minute of silence, if you will. We've been rather fortunate in Oregon City that up to this point we did lose an officer in line of duty before, but that was in 1906, and I don't think we think about those kinds of things happening, and it's hit us all very hard. In any case, we're here as a joint study session with this great project. I had the opportunity to go to the major public participation that occurred at Moot about, was it not a month ago yet, is it? A few weeks ago. And it was well organized and a lot of public participation. And Tony, do you want to say a few words and before we start moving into something?
Maybe I'll just say something brief and then maybe turn over to Christina. We've been, as many of you know, we've been working on the Willamette Falls Legacy Project since February of 2011. We've had very great participation and assistance from not only the Commission and their guidance and the funds and the staff that they've made available, but also Metro, their staff, Clackamas County, the state of Oregon through the Regional Solutions team. And so as we've entered into this new phase of engaging the community and trying to determine what we would like to see on the Blue Heron property in the future, we finished a very extensive public outreach component where essentially the question was, if we did this right in 30 years and you're on the property, what do you see? What would you like to see? What wouldn't you like to see? And with our consultant Walker Macy and their team, we've taken what we've heard back from the community and we've started to try to refine that down into what that might look like on a map in terms of what are those opportunities, where would development occur, where wouldn't development occur. And so that's the phase that we're in right now with a goal of having something completed for a kind of a final recommendation in January and then in front of our Planning Commission in April. And so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Christine.
Before she does, I was rude as hosting this. I probably should have had introductions. So we'll let Christine do her introduction, even though we all know her. But we don't have that many opportunities for the city and the Planning Commission to come together. So we should have an introduction. Thank you, Christine.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Neely. Tonight we have many purposes for our meeting tonight. One is to bring the Planning Commission, City Commission together as another way to bring them in as we go through this 9-month process, to go from kind of the big picture dreaming, visioning stage to a very specific master plan and rezoning application, which you will come in front of the Planning Commission and City Commission in late spring and early summer. And as part of it, we've had community conversations, kind of the breadth and depth of Oregon City, the breadth of the region, the depth. We've met with local groups such as the Rotary and the Kiwanis and neighbor associations, but we've also met region-wide with advocacy groups like Restore Oregon and Willamette River Keepers. So groups that really share a passion for the 4 values that we have embedded in our program. Tomorrow is a special event and is a community conversation. We're calling the Professionals Community Conversation. We've invited planners, architects, landscape architects, and people interested in waterfront development down to the White Stag building over at the University of Oregon campus in Portland. And our speaker tonight will also be part of a panel which will be talking about waterfront development, looking at Centennial Mills, the project, one of the projects Mr. Meyer will be describing tonight, Mill Ruins Park, as well as our Willamette Falls Legacy Project. And this community conversation is also a way for professionals to get credit. So come to our project, get an hour and a half credit, and try to also build community champions throughout the region. And I'm becoming more and more aware as we go through this project that while it's very, very important to address the master plan and rezoning, what we do this year to help create community champions for this project region-wide and statewide, I'm realizing is becoming more and more important. So every opportunity we have to reach outside of Oregon City and explain how incredibly amazing the Willamette Falls site is and how it is a state and national treasure, I think it helps give this long-term implementation a chance. So one of my SLY goals tomorrow is to start really inspiring some of our local design leaders so they keep in mind and they can talk to their people and they can once again bring this outside of Oregon City and make the rest of the state acknowledge how amazing we are. So what we'd like to do tonight is I'd like to introduce Tom Meyer. He's an architect with MSR Architects in Minneapolis, and Tom has been involved in award-winning projects that not only waterfront redevelopment, but also adaptive reuse and historic rehabilitation. And tonight he's going to talk about a couple projects. He has about a 30-40 minute presentation, and then we're going to let the Planning and City Commission ask some questions, and at that very end we'll open up questions to the group to ask. But really, this is a time for inspiration, time to learn some lessons, and hopefully events like this will help us realize that we can do this. We can make this happen. And through this, waterfront redevelopment happens everywhere in the world. And we have the building blocks to do it. We just need to work together to figure out how we're going to get from where we are in year zero to this amazing redeveloped place. So one is to bring in people who have done it and learn from their wisdom. So I'd like to introduce Tom Meyer with MSR Architects.
Thank you, Tom. And while you're coming up here, we'll introduce ourselves to you, starting with Tom Guile. And you would?
You said it, Tom Guile. Oh, it's not on. Tom Guile, Planning Commission.
Damon Mabee, Planning Commission.
Rocky Smith, City Commission.
Kathy Roth, City Commission.
Charles Kidwell, Planning Commission.
Doug Neely, Oregon City Mayor.
Zach Henkin, Planning Commission.
Betty Mumm, Oregon City Commission.
Bob Mahoney, Planning Commission.
Carol Pauley, City Commission.
Nancy Ide, City Recorder.
And I'm Tony Conkle, Community Development
And I'm woefully ignorant of what's transpired. Who's the chair of the Planning Commission here? You still are? Okay, good. I heard rumors somebody else might be, but they haven't out done you out yet.
The coup is next month.
No, that's next month that happens? Oh, okay. Very good, Tom.
Well, thank you for inviting me to come here tonight. I was here as part of a team competing for this work last spring, and sadly for me, we didn't get it, but I had the chance to learn about the falls and come and visit it and do an interview at that point. And it is truly an amazing asset that you have. And so I thought of it at that time as the thing that I wanted to be part of my life for, as long as my career was going to take, because it'll take a long time to do this project of yours, but it's truly an awesome asset. So what I have is 3 waterfront projects that we have some involvement with, and I'm going to spend the most of the time with the first one, which is in Minneapolis, which I know the most about. Then we'll go on to the others. But I want to just start with a couple of things that aren't photographs. Robert Campbell is the architecture critic for the Boston Globe and a distinguished commenter on architecture, and he says it's a lot easier to design a utopia than to deal with the complex reality of present time and place. You don't have to deal with the tension between memory and invention. You just take one or the other. And if you do that, you inevitably create architecture that's thin, bloodless, weak, and boring. So basically what he's saying is that, and I think as it might apply to your site, is that there certainly is some things there that want to be preserved into preservation standards, but you also need some new things to flush it out. And there's some things that probably have to come down to make way for that. And what he's saying is that that's really where great architecture can reside. When you have a historic fabric and you're building new 21st century within it, that's where the blood and the strong and the not boring reside. And just to add to that duality of old and new, you can see that oops, I'm sorry. We're going to have to get used to this thing here.
You have to use the other thing.
It must be this button, yeah?
No, you have a different device. You put.
Oh, that's true. I'm sorry. Getting used to all my gizmos here. But, so the previous quote was talking about preservation and sort of the best of new architecture. But these days you can add to that triangle sustainability. So by recycling buildings, reusing them through conservation, that really the sweet spot is where all of those three things come together. And I'm sure that all three of these have been part of the debates or the conversations that you've undertaken. So the first project is Mill City Museum in Minneapolis, and it's really, Mill City Museum is a complex of buildings, but it's really about the broader riverfront development, kind of through the lens of this one project. The Mississippi, as perhaps you know where it is, of course, but the only waterfall on the Mississippi River is in Minneapolis, and that's why Minneapolis exists. It would be a suburb of St. Paul, is what the people in St. Paul like to say, if it weren't for the waterfall. As the river goes through from north to south, the waterfall is right here in the center of the city. Downtown is here. You can see that like your city, originally the grid was set up to be responsive to the geometry of the river, and then only later on, as the city started to grow away from the river, did they pick up the true north-south grid. These are some early paintings of the pre-settlement view of St. Anthony Falls. And it was discovered, you might say in quotes, by a Jesuit priest who was exploring, Father Hennepin, in the 1620s or so, and he named it after St. Anthony. Of course, the native people had been coming there for years, centuries before that, just as I understand they have here at your waterfall. By the time milling started to happen, the painting looked something like this. And this is just part of the waterfall. There's a whole other section on the other side of this island. But it drops only about 40 or 50 feet, but there's a tremendous volume of water because the Mississippi is fairly wide at that point. That's an image, the last one from about, let's say, 1860. This is about 20 years later. So you see the city has grown from basically a prairie into, well, you can still see the edge of town here, but this is the milling district. Some 40-some buildings along the both sides of the river and on Nicollet Island here, all drawing on water power. This was one of the nation's largest sources of horsepower in the pre-electric era. And the prairie all the way around here is perfect for growing wheat, and the waterfall is perfect at that time for making flour. So by 1920s or 30s, the complex looked like this. And I'm going to be talking about this building in particular. I'm sorry to have all you guys having to look around. Maybe I'll just put this thing down and describe it. You won't have to feel like you got to twist your neck. But to continue the views, this is a view from, let's say, about 1980 or 93 or so. But you can see that the mill district down by the waterfall there is much diminished from that previous image. There's maybe a third of it left. There's what used to be rail yards are now parking lots, and basically the industry had gone away, and nothing really had taken its place yet at that point. So what was happening here, in addition to the prairies opening up for wheat growing, was the Industrial Revolution coming to milling. So water turbines, railroad, methods to control the riparian rights and sell water rights to all these individual mill owners was coming on board. And then the rollers, something called the gradual reduction process. So instead of two big millstones grinding together, it went through these kind of the grain went through these rollers, and it went through many separate machines in a whole vertical process. You can see this on the right, where in this 8-story building, which for a while was the world's largest flour mill, those roller mills that you saw are on the bottom row there, lined up, if you can recognize that. And the partially made flour would go up to the top and be sifted and sorted and so on. And the water turbines were down in those pits at the bottom. So 2 turbines turned hundreds of individual machines in this one building, and there were about 40 buildings like that up and down the river. This is what those roller mills looked like. Yep, actually they use a very similar machine still to make flour. They lined them up like this, all turned with belts and pulleys coming from that central shaft, and you see all the flour on the floor. That was probably not Pillsbury's best on the floor there, although the stuff that they took off the rollers first was what they sold as their premium flour, so Pillsbury's best or gold medal flour, and the stuff that went through the machines more often went to the bakeries. But around World War I, and partly because of the devastation in Europe, Minneapolis flour mills bragged that they fed the world, and that would be partially correct in that a lot of the flour did go back to Europe. As it went to Europe, even as the people from Europe were migrating to the Twin Cities to work in the mills and the rail yards, and the bagging companies and the people who made the machinery. So it really spawned a whole immigration as well as. That is limestone, coming from actually within a few blocks of the mill on the riverfront. Betty Crocker Kitchen started in this particular building. And really what happened here is, I'm old enough to remember that my mother bought flour in, I think 50-pound sacks and made everything, right? Cookies and bread. Well, people don't do that anymore. And what happened here is they invented stuff like Bisquick and Cheerios and basically added value to flour and made products. And that's why, and General Mills was a consolidation of many of these individual buildings, as the name implies, and its headquarters is still in the Twin Cities area. There were all kinds of other industries that also were spawned by the milling, with all those wheels and pulleys, and we still have a very significant medical device industry in the Twin Cities. Flour dust is extremely explosive. If you count your calories, you know that one slice of bread has got a lot of calories in it. Well, calorie is a measure of heat, and with the whole building full of dust, one spark, it almost instantly creates a huge explosion. So this particular building that I'm going to be talking about burned down 3 times in its career. It was built in 1874. 4 years later, it blew up, killed 18 millers, and it shattered windows a mile away, it was said. The explosion was so powerful. This is a plaque that's dedicated to those millers. By the time the Depression came around in 1930, electrical power was available, so you didn't need to be on a waterfall to mill grain anymore. Plus, the recession took the Depression took a huge toll on agriculture and industry. So a lot of the mills in the foreground here were torn down, and some of them actually they put generators on top of the old turbines and made, for a period of years, made electricity. But that was the beginning of the significant decline. Between about 1880 and 1930, Minneapolis was the milling capital of the world. Then there was a slow decline. So by the 70s, the rail yards that served the mills were pretty much vacant. The city had grown away from the river. It was just kind of an isolated spot. Homeless people. It was kind of a scary place for most folks. And a whole generation had grown up not even really knowing there was a river going through through the center of the city. Certainly not a waterfall, because you couldn't get to it. In 1991, the city had purchased the building for redevelopment and a whole bunch of riverfront property. And this is where it starts to maybe cross into what you're doing here. And under the city's watch, the building burned down on a February day. Probably homeless people getting in, trying to keep warm, and a fire got away from them, although nobody really knows. The next day, the building looked like this. All of that wooden machinery and the heavy timber construction burned out, leaving just the stone walls. And it was, of course, an enormous mess. There were PCBs and asbestos in it, and it looked pretty hopeless. But what was happening behind the scenes for probably 15 years before that was a series of planning efforts by both the Historical Society, the State Historical Society, the City of Minneapolis, and the city's park folks. And so when this building burned down, it became a catalyst for taking action and actually getting on with a significant public investment in a building on the river. So we were hired. We had been doing some of the studies prior to this fire in 1991, but we were hired afterwards to start to look at some master planning for the milling complex and how it would fit into the riverfront. So we built a model, and we left part of that ruined building in ruins, even though there was a new building that's kind of dropped inside of it. And it was thought of as a mixed-use building that was partially museum, partially offices, and surrounded by housing and new development. This was in the early 90s, and we had to convince the city council folks that their investment in the property was not going to be a stone around their neck by continuing to keep this ruined building until a developer came along, because this was just an idea at this point. We showed them images of ruins in Europe that had been reoccupied, but at that time they had used TIF money to buy not just this elevator grain milling complex, but they brought a big brewery, and they also bought a series of theaters. So one of the council people stood up when it was proposed that they should invest more in this ruined mill and said, we own a brewery that doesn't make beer, we own theaters that don't do performances, we own a mill that doesn't make flour, and now you want us to invest another $5 million to preserve it until somebody comes along. And but they did. And TIF financing was pretty strong at that point. We developed design principles for it. The park people, which is a separate entity in Minneapolis, a separate taxing entity than the city, had also been doing planning at the same time. So there you see something they called Mill Ruins Park right in front of the burned out mill there. So it was kind of there was a variety of people. There was getting some momentum. Parks, city, private development, Minnesota Historical Society. There was starting to be some real momentum going, as well as some, which I'll show you in a little bit here, a lot of development that was happening at different places, kind of on the fringes of the central riverfront.
Were those locks?
Yes. There's a lock and dam here put in 1956. Sort of, people think of it as kind of a pork barrel thing. It just goes up about 3 miles. That's the end of the navigation on the Mississippi River. It's actually, interestingly enough, probably going to close, both because there isn't much industry left, but also because it's the last best barrier to Asian carp, which are making their way up the Mississippi River. And if they get up above the falls, they can invade all of our 10,000 lakes, and probably, who knows what will happen, but it probably would be a disaster. Now, we started planning for the museum about this time, and I'll just go through these quickly, but there might be some relevance as you think about the historic content here. So what are the stories? That's what we mean by content. So in Minneapolis, it was water power, lumber, flour, civil engineering, settlement, and geology. All those stories were embodied in these buildings. Master planning was done around the complex along the river. A lot of things survived that fire, believe it or not in the main building, but in the adjacent buildings. So we surveyed that to see what else was historic and worthy of preservation. We looked at the milling process, which, if you remember that sectional drawing, was a very complicated process, just to understand how that might play into interpretation, actually. And that was basically a gravity process going up, with flour going up and down 8 stories. There was an idea about a flour tower, which is an exhibit where people would go up and down to see the milling process as it existed on 8 levels of this building. This was from the interpretive people at the Historical Society. There was also historic facades to be restored and preserved. And this idea of a ruined courtyard, again, came up. And I'll just take a minute here to say, well, why would you not restore the building completely? Why would you just put part of it in? Well, the reason is that it was impossible to recreate the heavy wooden timber and the patina of 150 years of accreted change, and all the machinery was gone. So the only thing that was actually probably going to happen if we fully restored it was that you'd have a great big disappointment when you went through the stone walls and you went into what would probably be something like an ordinary office building. And so the only authentic thing that remained after the fire that could be fully restored was part of it as a ruin. And given the fact that this building had burned down 3 times and other mills had burned down too, it was part of the history and part of the story. So we looked at what kind of new facade do we put into that ruined building. This is set back from the courtyard. Looked at a variety of different ideas, and in the end incorporated this drawing into that facade by putting it on the glass of the new of the courtyard wall, part of that drawing. So this is the machinery on that drawing put in its proper position at full scale. So the whole drawing is about this big, but we blew it up to life size, 8 stories tall, and put it on the glass. So there's a combination of old and new architecture, that drawing, a glass elevator that goes up to the observation deck at the top, and then this courtyard in the center. And we weren't quite sure what was going to happen in this courtyard, but we thought it would be a popular place, or hoped it would be. This is another view of the whole complex. This is housing on one side. There's housing on the other side. There's 5 stories of offices, 3 stories of museum. There's more. There's a population of almost 30,000 people in downtown Minneapolis, probably about 15,000 on the riverfront, and that's all grown up in the last 20 years. So I'll just take you quickly from the downtown side through the building to the river. And one of the goals of the design of this building was that it's not a barrier to the river, it's a gateway to the river. So most museums, you go in one door, you see the exhibits, you come back out. In this one, you go right on through, and you can stop at a variety of things, but if you keep going right on through, you get to the river. And that was the idea. So there's sort of layers of old and new architecture as you progress through this thing. And you see the ruined courtyard up ahead of you there. And through the old burned out windows, you see the river and the Stone Arch Bridge. And then you turn at the rail corridor. One of the railroad lines went right through the middle of the building. And there's exhibits that describe the railroading process. And we preserve this outdoor shed. And it's become an event center, including this Saturday farmers market that's become a huge community attraction. If you carry down the stairs, from the downtown side, you're on the 3rd level. So you go down to the courtyard level, which is closer to the river. Here's the courtyard. It's sort of an everyday situation. You get these kind of views around it. But my partner's daughter was married in this courtyard, and she had to make her wedding plans 2 years in advance to get a Saturday in June because it's such a popular place. There's music performances, opera. Mill City Summer Opera is here, which has become quite a wonderful spectacle. It's all the tickets sold out for 10 performances in 36 hours this summer. And nobody, even thought about opera, of course, when we were doing this. It just, it was sort of an example, or even the farmers market. It was just sort of that something cool was there, and people, after we did our work, found ways to use it and make it their own. The museum itself has water power exhibits based on the falls. It has milling exhibits. Betty Crocker's kitchen is in part recreated, so kids don't really know what it's like to bake bread anymore. So school kids come in here and they bake cookies, they make bread, they get demonstrations. They also you get cookbook authors come in and give lectures. This is the Flower Tower. So that's a freight elevator with some seats in it. And there's 8 stops on this, and it goes up and down, and the freight elevator opens up. I tell you, the hardest thing we did was to convince the elevator code official that this was a good idea. When you get to the top, there's some milling machinery that survived, and that's part of the story, because it was a gravity process. If you can see what's at the bottom and on the way up, then you can understand the milling process. But the real reason was to get on the top so you could see the river. The whole reason that anything was here, and just off to the left in this picture is the waterfall itself. And you get this kind of view when you're up there looking through the ruins and through old and new architecture, back down into the courtyard. And again, this was probably about 10 years ago when this photo was taken. But all of this is actually some of the most expensive housing in Minneapolis are in these buildings in the foreground. Those 4 water towers, the penthouse unit up there sold for $4 million about a year ago. And I think that might be the most expensive property in the city boundaries of Minneapolis. There's some lakefront property that sold for more further out. But beyond this project now, I want to just sort of say, kind of how does it all add up? Well, you can see these 2 images here, the same from the same angle. $25 million of property value, property tax value in 1994. 475 in 2011. This is just on one side of the river in this Central Rivers district. In the 70s, you couldn't get to I was telling you that people didn't even know there was a river in the city. Well, you couldn't get to it because there was industry along it. In that same angle now, there's parks, and that whole idea of Mill Ruins Park that you may remember there's a whole bunch more ruins underneath here, which are going to be excavated like this, and there's a study underway right now to do the planning for that. The Stone Arch Bridge opened up, which was a rail bridge, and now it's one of the most, this is the second most visited park in the city of Minneapolis. We're very proud of our parks, and we have many visitors that come in from the whole region to use our park system. But this riverfront, this is a festival, so it's not that many people on your average day, but there are a lot of people who use it. You see the rail yards converted into housing, and all that rail yard was full of diesel fuel and other terrible things. It all had to be remediated before it could be sold to developers. So in a nutshell, and this data is a little bit old at this point, but almost, let's say $2 billion of private investment leveraged by $340 million of public investment. And the public invested in remediation, parks and trails, development costs, infrastructure, putting in the streets, and so on. This is over a 40-year period in a bigger city, but I guess you can say that your investments do pay off. This is not just us; it's happening all over, not just us in Minneapolis. It's happening all over the place. And so, sorry to have you look around again, but this is that mill complex I was talking about. But the whole district that those numbers apply to is really all the way around here. So the first developments were some parks that were bought and a few development projects. You see those 2 little pink squares in the late 70s. Then there was a spurt of activity in the 80s, and some of this we in Minneapolis have come to regret. It was sort of that first round where everybody was kind of desperate to get something built. And some of it's really good and enduring, but some of it is not great architecture. And if it were being built now, the citizens would come out and demand that it be better. But it got the ball rolling, and then the next 10 years, more happened, and you can see in particular how parks coming online, start to be a big chunk of this. And then in the current increment, all the purple stuff, not all of that is developed, but most of it is, and is pretty well fitted out. One of the significant things you see, Mill City Museum there on the right. On the left, the Guthrie Theater decided to move from a kind of a pricey, established neighborhood park to the riverfront. And when they did, and Mill City Museum was there, then there were two major public institutions on the riverfront side by side. And then I think we all felt like we'd finally kind of made it fully. What's going on now is a plan for more park development. The area right in front of the mills, right at the central riverfront, was developed as park, but it wasn't really completed. It was just sort of like temporary parking lots and grass and asphalt. And the idea is to take a place like this, which is kind of a wonderful spot, to be sure, just the way it is, but to bring more stairs down, do some planting, and take some of the tunnels which are underneath all this and make them accessible. So this is not something you'd cook up to do 30 years earlier, but now that this is sort of a fairly mature project, we can start to fine-tune it with some of these other niceties over time. Or take this, that's the parking lot there right in the middle of the shot that you see, that's temporary, and bring some water back into the old canal system, make a new plaza. So take a scene like this where the lock and dam are and that parking lot there, and turn it into something more like this. And this is currently in planning.
Just while you're on those photos, I know questions are later. Does that flood when the Mississippi floods any of those parks?
They don't, because there's so much water moving, and it's in kind of a gorge at that point, so it floods down at the water level, but there isn't much there by way of built stuff. Now, because the Central Riverfront has been deemed such a success, the parks people in Minneapolis took on, and the city took on, the upper 5 miles of the riverfront, which is a harder case, frankly, because it's not quite as appealing. There's no waterfall. There aren't as many people. The poorest neighborhoods are up there. There's a freeway that separates the river from the water on one side, and there's a lot of decayed industry, and it's 5 miles. The Central Riverfront was about a mile from one end to the other, so there's a lot more, but planning is beginning. And interestingly, it's a whole different kind of park. It's a much more ecological park. It's not grass and trees. It's restoring wetlands for habitat, kayakers, and if there was a before shot of this, it would be a pretty desolated and industrial site. Now, I'm going to really quickly go over it because I don't want to take too long. We've been going on about a half an hour here, and show you 2 other projects. Now, this first one, Mill City, was really in the way, I would say it was, there were many people over a 40-year period who contributed, both private and public, champions, public and private money. But Mill City Museum was an example of a catalyst being a public institution, a cultural institution, a museum in that case. That really sort of pushed the development to a higher level because it brought people there. This is an example of a company coming in to a waterfront and making a huge and almost immediate difference. So the Navy Yard in Philadelphia is on the Delaware River. It's been there for a long time. You see the center of Philadelphia up there. Right after the Civil War, it was a small complex. It got bigger around World War I. You can see the orange square is our site. And this is what it looked like even 5 years ago, 6, 8 years ago when we started working on it. It looked not so much different than this. Here you see it now. And you see the profile of Philadelphia way in the background there. This slide's a little bit old. Phase 1 and 2 and part of Phase 3 are now complete. And basically what happened is these buildings were bought by the city of Philadelphia from the Navy. They cleaned up the pollution, and they put them on the market for $1 for someone who would want to develop them. We got a phone call on the day before Thanksgiving 6 years ago from the CEO of Urban Outfitters, the clothing company. My partner got the call. He thought somebody was joking because the guy said, I've got this, historic Navy Yard. I want to do a $200 million project over 5 years. And, people don't just call up architects like that. But we flew out the day after Thanksgiving, and we got the commission. So the buildings looked like this on the outside and the inside, really kind of a mess. This was between the wars, between World War I and World War II, it would look like this. And then the war would happen and it'd be this tremendous beehive. Like the battleship New Jersey was built here, which is the last big gunship that America built. So this was a very historic place. So, and they wanted to do this project instantly, Urban Outfitters. They have clothing designers, all their corporate people, and it fits their brand. And what this is their program. This is what they wanted to do. They just put together some pictures and words that described their brand in the marketplace. And just anecdotally, if you buy you can have the same T-shirt, but different people will buy an Abercrombie and Fitch T-shirt, and then there's another audience for a Gap T-shirt, and another one for an Urban Outfitters T-shirt, right? And it's the same damn T-shirt, but their brand is to sort of, you might say it's kind of like maybe for suburban kids who want to be kind of hip and urban, right? So they kind of promote this in their ads, and the Navy Yard was perfect for their brand because it had all this patina, this kind of gritty urban industrial stuff. So we did some planning really quickly. In Minneapolis, this kind of planning took years. Here we did it in a few months, and because they bought it for $1, they got historic tax credits and they had corporate money behind it. So all these buildings have been restored on the outside, landscape put between them. The old rail lines, there was a light, narrow gauge rail that served all these buildings. It's turned into landscape. The wharf, the dry dock is turned into a lagoon. This is all now grown up with tall grasses. A lot of the materials from demolished buildings was turned into the landscape that you see there, landscape aggregate. Space like this was turned into the food center, not just for Urban Outfitters, but for the whole Navy Yard. So you get sailors, and there's other businesses that are in new buildings outside the historic part of this. You see the ships right outside the window. Lots of interesting interior design that we and they did together because they are a design company. Cool places to work. Recycled materials, not only from this complex but from all over the East. We found recycled materials. Lots of mostly young women working as clothing designers. But this amazing kind of interior. This is not really what you'd call pure preservation. It's really adaptive reuse is the better use because we made a lot of changes. And this might be interesting for you to think about. These buildings were all built to be changed. This is not a cathedral or a city hall that was thought of as being the same way. They were built to be changed and modified. So this whole structure in here was added in World War II to get another floor in this building. So we made the case to the Department of Interior, who approves tax credits, that a certain amount of that change is part of the authenticity of an industrial building. And the outsides, they were very rigorous about preserving them, but the insides, we made the case about a sort of accreted change over time. Okay, then finally, just a little bit about Centennial Mill in Portland. You maybe all know this because it's a local project. We started working, it was a competition that PDC put on to developers and architects. Our team won about 7 years ago, before the recession. And you see, I'll have to point this out. Oops. That's Centennial Mill. This is the Pearl District. And of course, there's a trail along here. There's the parks blocks go through, but this Centennial Mills is sort of the last missing link. The PDC bought it to tear it down and turn it into a park to complete that link. The community said, can't we have a park and preserve some of the historic buildings? And they rethought about it and put it out for developers and architects. We won the competition. And then it was a casualty of the recession after a 5-year struggle where our developer went away. But you see the complex here with the Pearl in the background. And basically our original approach with the developer was to, you see here some of the basic interior shots, was to build almost no new architecture. Basically just to remove some of the warehouse, one-story warehouse structure to make public wharffront land or deck and put a lot of retail and food-oriented businesses in what remained. And we had the colors indicate what's preserved, you know, to preservation standards, what's adaptively reused by making more modifications, and then what in the blue, what's actually removed to make public space. We did some other planning, like you see here, to connect it back to the Pearl. And in the end, again, about maybe a third of the footprint on the wharf was turned into this public deck. Some of it under glass roofs, a lot of landscaping, places to get down to the water, a big bridge that came across the Amtrak line on NATO from the Pearl, coming across like this, going through one of the elevators. There are 3 wooden elevators, and if you don't know the construction of these elevators, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Just more shots. So this is one of the elevators here, this blank building, and it's built out of 2x10s and 2x6s laid flat, like a log cabin up 8 stories. So the bins are solid wood. You know, wood was cheap, right, and available. And this is all, of course, virgin Douglas fir, I imagine, maybe hemlock. And you can kind of see how that's built to make the bins that are inside. So if you buy a case of wine and you take the wine out, what you have is basically the cardboard that's left. Here's one in Superior, Wisconsin that's being dismantled for the wood. And what they do is take it apart there and turn it, you know, and they sell it. But there's a sort of beauty in this that we've felt in the extraction of the material from these elevators. So we were looking to you know, take this kind of wine case grid and saw out a piece of wall that's solid 6 inches of wood and lay that down to make a floor where there isn't a floor, and to make a whole building out of that. And that's what these are looking at, because there's a whole lot of structural capability in this, because they're all spiked together. A new bridge that came across from the Pearl District. Just looked at the design of that in a variety of ways. It went right through one of these elevators, so you could experience this all-wood environment. And then you keep going, and you wind up on that kind of gangplank in one of those earlier pictures right over the river. You have your, I'm forgetting now, I think 4 big principles. Mm-hmm. Yep. PDC has 5. And at this point, we always presented back to them in terms of those principles, you know, so that everybody was always on the same page. So strengthen connectivity between the river and the Pearl, community focal point across from that park, capturing history or preservation, sustainability, and then finally provide open space. And again, this was you know, kind of the final image. Now, that all fell apart. Because of the recession, PDC's politics changed, and money was a lot tighter. They said that the developer needed to provide 75,000 square feet of office space to provide jobs in order to get the city's money. That was a new requirement after we'd been working on it for 5 years. The developer was irritated with that, to say the least, and they sued the city. What the city will say, or PDC will say, is that the developer was looking to get out of it anyway because of the recession, and that could have been. I don't know the truth, but it was not a amicable parting. But it went back on the market, and we are working with Harsh Development out of Portland now, along with other local architects and landscape architects. And you see the complex here this is an aerial photo from a few months ago. But now it's a significant. If the first run at this was basically to remove a lot of stuff and make public space and build almost nothing new, and maybe be a $30 million project in its entirety, this is now has 12 or 15 stories of housing, a retail and office complex. The historic chunk is right in the middle, opposite Fields Park over here, and they're also negotiating with the adjacent property owner. There's a low industrial building here, but this represents what might be built there. So it's a very different approach. This is probably, who knows, $200 million of construction. So very much bigger project. Different team, different developer, different approach to it, and because it's so early, I can't say a lot about it because it's going to change, and our developer wants to, rightly so, sort of control the communications on this. So I'll just give you sort of this overview of it. But the elevator that we were talking about, the wood elevator, is now an office complex there. So what you see in that night shot is wood floors, wood ceiling, wood walls, everything this glowing wood. Here's a shot of what could be, let's say, an institutional use inside that wooden elevator. You can kind of see the remains of the bins going up and down, and the wood grain. This is a suggestion that it might be kind of whitewashed in character. And that was my last slide. So I'm sorry I went a little bit long, but I hope that it stimulated some questions and some discussion.
Just so we have a framework to operate under, we do have a summer meeting coming in at 7, is that right?
Correct.
We probably can go a little bit beyond the time we devoted here and open, first of all, questions to the two commissions that are here. Has anybody?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So the last slides of what was going on in the Pearl District, did that come out of a master planning process, or how far did the city get involved with that, and how much came from the prospective developers?
Well, so much of the adjacent properties are already developed. Mm-hmm. Pretty much everything on the other side of NATO is either claimed or planned. And so our planning was, I don't know if I can get back to that. It's not wanting to cooperate here, but I think my sense is that most of the planning had been done years before, and that that parcels had been developed that individual developers could then claim and plan within those boundaries. Right. Because that's what we're doing. We're not really looking. We only look beyond it for kind of context. Oh, thank you. There you go. Thanks, Christina.
So there most likely was a master plan then?
Yes, there was. Yes, to your. We looked at several versions of master planning for the Pearl and for the waterfront. And of course, during those plans, some of the regulations about setbacks and the greenway and things evolved and changed and became new regulations.
I have a question. How far along is this project? Because I work for the Bureau of Development Services for City of Portland, and I hear something about this every day. And usually things don't get into my hearing range until things are moving.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that exactly. The developer, Harsh Development, Jordan Schnitzer, have been very open about their intentions and had, have met with the mayor and community people and so on. And but they're still in the negotiation, or they're working on their memo of understanding with PDC. So they haven't made any formal submission of anything, even though they've solicited things in. They're not public meetings. He's very clear about that. But there are people who are stakeholders, let's say, who have been invited in to participate. So the idea is that sometime pretty soon, a formal package will go to PDC that will fulfill the memo of understanding, and a development agreement would be negotiated based on that. So that's the work we're doing.
Okay.
And I would guess that maybe in 6 months that could be completed.
Okay.
I have a further question for you. Based on the one I asked before, what happened in Minneapolis was spectacular, all that green space and all those parks. And I keep thinking of, we've always heard the flooding on the Mississippi and the Missouri, and when the snow melts up there in the winters. And I keep thinking what's happened here in Oregon City with the floods around our falls and down through Portland. And I keep wondering, you said something about the flow, and I wasn't quite sure. We have a fast flow too, but sometimes it can get backed up when you get those heavy rains and quick snow melt. And I was wondering how they coped with that, because those are beautiful.
Well, of course, the floodplains, 10-year, 100-year, 500-year are all mapped out. And all of this physical building development respects those boundaries. There are many overlays of regulation that actually, this is little known, but there is a 72-mile urban national park, which is the Mississippi River Corridor. And it's a national park like Yellowstone's a national park, except they don't own any land. It's a regulatory agency. So they impose height limits, floodplain limitations, water quality issues. The state has a piece of it through the Department of Natural Resources, the city and the county. So it's very parks. So there's many regulatory layers. But to your question, nobody's building in the floodplain, and when it does flood, it's the parks that will, the parkway will get closed because there'll be water on it.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, but these are places where damage is, kind of cleaning up for a week afterwards, sweeping the mud off the sidewalks and that kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you.
You had a chance to look at our site.
Yes.
And of course, the Minneapolis project is one that's always being drawn to us as we're hearing discussions because of a lot of similarities. Is it, 16 out of the 23 acres is out of the floodplain, or do I have that number right?
I think it's 9 and...
It's about 9.
Yeah.
9 out?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so so I guess it was about 16. Anyway, they got them switched. The challenges are there, of course, as Tom has pointed out, but still the existing structures that are there within the floodplain might be used in some fashion.
Well,
you have a reaction to that? I mean, they withstood heavy floods. Some structures.
There's all kinds of issues with using a building in the floodplain. Insurance being one of them, and all the regulatory layers that are upon this. So I don't know what's going on here, but I would be doubtful about that happening. Sometimes, well, even at Centennial, the lower levels of that building floods. And our plan is to put parking down there. And for 2 weeks every 5 years, when it's flooded, there won't be cars down there, is the plan. Because that's a predictable thing, and it's, you can clean it up with a certain maintenance budget. But any habitable space, I can't imagine how that would fly in the end.
I wasn't thinking things that would be flooded, but things that are actually above the floodplain.
Yeah.
But
I'm just trying to get to one of these pictures that, because just in terms of scale, having, tried to get this project, I'm getting there. Okay, this, I think, I was trying to, when I was putting this slideshow together, I think your site is about this big, right? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, like 5 blocks. Is your site about 5 blocks?
Yes, but our blocks are 40,000 square feet.
Small blocks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, these are 300 square foot, 300 on side blocks. Mm-hmm. So maybe you're something like that, just for scale. And that's pretty much what I was talking about, even though, all those numbers, that $2 billion and stuff is for this whole zone. What I was talking about primarily was right in that central, about the same size as yours.
Do you foresee any major explosions down there?
Well, I can tell you that Target Corporation is headquartered in Minneapolis, and they throw the biggest fireworks every summer. And they get 15,000 people on the waterfront to watch the fireworks, and it's an amazing display. So it kind of feels like the mills are blown up.
You said that once the music people, the symphony orchestra, got located down there?
The Guthrie Theater.
The Guthrie Theater?
Yeah.
Theatrical plays and things of that nature, is that what you're talking about?
Yep.
My thought has always been that if you put people on the site, that the commerce will follow. Has that been the case in the, given the people a reason to go there?
Yeah. Well, this is a long, complicated story. So the first people to come down here after all the industry had pretty much gone away were entrepreneurs, small-scale entrepreneurs. A Japanese-American woman opened a Japanese restaurant that became kind of a cult almost, because you had to go across railroad tracks and, to get there. But people would do it. They'd come from 20 miles away because you could see the river. Another architecture student, a guy's a friend of mine that's just graduated, bought a building for $11,000 and lived there and right on the water, and opened a bar a few years later, and so on. So first people in were kind of early entrepreneurs. Then some bigger developers came along. But this part of the river, this kind of the downtown side, kind of languished until Mill City Museum came along. Even the thought of planning about it, the building opened 10 years ago, and planning started almost 20 years ago for Mill City Museum. And so when the state when people were starting to feel like the state was likely to give some money, the Historical Society was raising money, and the county said that they were in for something. At that point, it really was a kind of catalytic thing. And the quality of everything went up too, because then there were kind of major cultural institutions that were making a commitment. They were going to do really good architecture and good planning. So anybody else who was building something, the kind of bar was raised. There was that period where people first started building, where there was a lot of land up and down there, and public officials were very happy to see anything happen after their investment. And so there are a few things that are looked back, as I mentioned, that were kind of mistakes. but not so much. I mean, really, it probably just almost was inevitable in a way.
Does the museum attract mainly local people, or is it advertised nationally to
No,
attract?
it's the second most visited site in Minneapolis now, behind our Art Institute. The park in front of it is the second most visited park. Like when the Vikings play the Packers on Monday Night Football, it's likely that the image of that building will be played at halftime or at commercials like they do. It's been published all over the place. I get architects from Europe wanting to talk to me and want drawings, and it's in European magazines. It's become a big deal. Candidates for office kick off their campaigns there. And,
I had some questions. Go ahead.
One more comment. It would seem to me what you're saying is preserve absolutely everything we can afford to preserve until we have something to go forward with.
well, I would say a couple things. One is that each situation's very different, just between Portland and Philadelphia and Minneapolis. Our experience was very, very different. But what I would say in that regard, though, is it would depend on what you mean by preservation. I think that that there may be some buildings that want to be preserved to the highest kind of preservation standards. But then I think that there's likely to be buildings that you want to be a lot more flexible with, because they were never built as static things. Their authenticity is about change in industry and modification and additions and accretion. And that gives you lots of flexibility to be accommodating through good design to new enterprise. So that first quote I put up there is what I think was what I'd advise you hang on to, is that you want the best of the 18th and the 19th and 20th century. We also want the best of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get a healthy mix of those two things, you'll have a really vibrant and flexible thing, flexible for different uses, different economics, but architecturally and as a community, great cities are almost always layers of history. The thing to hang tough on is to make sure the design's good, and that's a hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But
Thank you.
yeah.
John.
Of course, it sounds a little bit like the Minneapolis project. The falls alone and access to the falls was not a sufficient catalyst to get the whole thing going. You have to have other things supplementing that.
Yes. What I'd say is that this bridge, the Stone Arch Bridge, in this photo is after the fire. You can see the burned out building, so it's probably from about 1992 or so. The parkway did not go through yet. So there's a park that comes like 20 miles. It comes to this point and dead ends. There's another one that comes like 8 miles and dead ends there. This was a railroad bridge you couldn't get across. In a period of about 3 or 4 years, the park went through, the road went through, and this became a pedestrian bridge. And a couple of years later, the museum opened. So those things all coming together were the sort of tipping point in a way. So you could, you could see the falls from different places, but you couldn't really get to it. So there was something more that had to happen. Just looking at it from a block away was not sufficient, it seems to me. But when there was enough critical mass of parkland, then everybody kind of felt like it was really cool and the place to be.
I was going to make a comment. When I saw the pictures of the original falls, I thought, well, gee whiz, we weren't as great as we thought we were. But clearly, your falls have been modified dramatically.
Oh, yeah.
Where we have a lot of the natural original features there, which makes it, I think, a little different.
Yep. I mean, when I think of your falls, I think of that it's sort of amazing. You have this pure natural, really dramatic stone feature, and you have all the industrial
Yeah,
stuff
that's
too.
right.
So you've got really both things which are really interesting to people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
A comment and then a question. Is this on?
Yeah, it's okay.
Thanks. The comment is, you mentioned the population of that waterfront area is about 30,000, which is, of course, about the population of our entire city. To put things in perspective, I guess Minneapolis is pretty close to 400,000 now. You know? So I wouldn't expect anything quite on the same scale, and I just want to kind of temper all of this with that perspective. And I'm also curious about the ratio of public investment versus private investment. And how much of this was funded through TIF?
That's tax increment financing through urban.
Most of it, well, there was investments from different public sources. So TIF was a big tool for the city. The parks tended to be funded regionally. The central riverfront here, even though it's right in the middle of Minneapolis, is a designated regional park. And so that opens the door for regional funding. So they were able to capture that.
Was that TIF all voter approved?
No, not by referendum. It was through the city council. Now this was, since then, the state has clamped down on the TIF rules somewhat, so that's harder to do what was done in the 80s and 90s with TIF. Just to clarify that the 30,000 that I mentioned is sort of in neighborhoods that surround downtown and on both sides of the river. If I had to guess, I would say that maybe associated with the river is half that or something like that.
William, I'd like to point out, this is going to be such a great feature that the whole 1.5 million people in the general metropolitan area of this area are going to change their name to Greater Oregon City.
That's right.
Well, they all just are suburbs anyway.
That's right. We're running out of time a little bit. I'd like to know if kind of have any parting words to kind of give to us, elected officials, kind of, you've known the site, you've had your experience, kind of anything you'd want to give as almost either encouragement or also like a discerning eye to, don't do this or do this.
Well, thank you for that, the opportunity to do that. I'll tell it by way of an anecdote a little bit. When I was an architecture student at the University of Minnesota is just down the river a little ways. And that's where I went to study architecture. And I lived a few blocks from here, just kind of right about there. And my friends and I would come down here when this was at the ultimate of abandonment. Because we went across those railroad tracks and crawled out on the bridge when the trains were on it, and all the stuff you do when you're 19 or 21. And I fell in love with the river and all of everything, the milling and the whole thing. And I did my architectural thesis. I made up a project in 1971, which was a museum of the history of St. Anthony Falls. Well, almost 40 years later, that was a commission that I actually did. And my office is in that building, and I look back at all the places that I would drink beer with my college friends out, kind of illegally out there. And so the message in that is, there's two messages in that, and it's my personal experience. One is it takes a long time. It takes a long time, but to me, I look back and it seems like yesterday, right? Like,
Why don't you tell them?
Yeah.
All right. 40 years, if you got a son or daughter who's, 20 or 25 or something, you can imagine how does that go so fast.
Yes.
So one message is to be patient and find those champions. And there were some great people. There's I would say a person kind of in Christina's sort of place in the staff in the city of Minneapolis, who is the institutional memory of all of the waterfront stuff for 40 years. She should get a medal. And it's not because she was making the decisions, but she was there as the politicians were changing, new developers had come along, the economy would go up and down. She was always representing the same, the same set of ideas. They were evolving, but that was really important. So patience is one thing. The other thing is it's really, really cool. I mean, you know this, right? This is a national treasure. This is not kind of some local, nice place, like there are many in your part of the world here, where you've got mountains and trout streams and ocean and stuff. This is really a significant place, so it deserves the best, and it's a terribly exciting thing, and I think in 30 years or 25 years or whatever it takes to make a significant completion of something, maybe 5 or 10 years for some really significant change, that it'll be transformative. It just has to be transformative. And again, you think back at how quickly Minneapolis went from a prairie to 120,000 people in 30 years. Stuff happens quickly under the right circumstances.
Just one last question before we adjourn. Does the brewery produce beer?
No, it's an architect's office.
There's beer there then.
Yeah. But we, like you here, have many fine craft breweries all over the place. And there's another surprise. Who would have predicted that 15 or 20 years ago, right? So I think to some degree you have to take a cool asset and just know that it's going to draw the passion and money of other people over time.
Where did the flour mill go?
Oh, where do they make flour now?
Yeah, where do they make flour now?
Oh, there's no more flour made in Minneapolis now. Zero as of 1965.
Made in China.
And most of it's made out east, actually. They ship the grain out and make it where the biggest markets are.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Appreciate you all coming, and
Yeah.
we will have to depart very quickly because we do have a
if I can
CIC
do two
meeting.
little
Sure,
announcements.
absolutely.
Now that I have a captive audience, which I always like, remember if you haven't been to our Red's website, rediscoverthefalls.com, our survey is up. It was going through opt-in, but you can also get it straight on our website. Please take it before November 15th, so you can be added into the quantitative analysis. We'll have it up probably through the end of the year, but that'll be more of a qualitative if you don't take it after November 15th. We have our third community interactive event. I believe it's December 12th or 11th. It's going to be at the Ainsworth House, which will go through some additional alternative concepts, some more refining from the October meeting. And so both of those are on our website under the Get Involved section of Rediscover the Falls. So that was my parting. Get involved.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Great.
You better, Bob.